Hi, and welcome to Soul Searchers of Spring Hill. I'm Ricky, and today we're at another Spring Hill, Tennessee location. This time, it's the Spring Hill Cemetery, which is on Macklemore, which is a side street right off of Main Street. A lot of people are probably not aware that this historic cemetery sits right here on this back road, but we are going to take a tour and find out all the history right here in Spring Hill and the people that originally started this city of Spring Hill. So come join us. So today we're going to start on our tour with Mr. Bill Ossip, who is the Ambassador Emeritus for the Tennessee Children's Home. And thank you so much, Bill, for having us out today.
My pleasure.
Bill, if you would, if we could start with the story of the fact that you have been running tours inside of Ferguson Home,
Right.
As representing and in costume as Martin Shares. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. Martin Chairs actually built that house over there on the campus of the Children's Home, and it was the Chairs home until 1904, and that's when the name was changed by the Branham and Hughes Academy to Ferguson Home.
Okay,
So
and obviously we're here at the Shares family gravestone.
Yes.
So who is represented here?
Well, this is the father. This whole family came from South North Carolina. The Carolinas, they migrated over with a number of others, the McKissicks and the Whites and all. And on this side, and I don't know exactly how they're laid out here, but the father, the wife, and then over here on this side is Martin Chairs, the owner of the property over here. And it was this Martin Chairs on this side of the monument who actually donated the first acre of land for the cemetery.
And this was the first cemetery here in Spring Hill.
It was, and yet there were two other cemeteries. One, the McKissicks had one over here behind Dr. Hardin's house, and it was moved over here in the 1870s and 80s. And so you've got McKissicks along this area right here.
Was in this direction of Spring Hill?
Back over here,
okay.
by Dr. Hardin, the Hardin house. And so that cemetery, the family cemetery, was moved over here. The Peters Cemetery was located on the property of the Tennessee Children's Home. And I don't know exactly, I'm trying to find out exactly where it was. One record says it was where the ball field is located, which is over here at the corner of Scotton Street and School Street. And if the cemetery were located there at one time, that would just be some searching that we might have to do.
Right.
Maybe soul searchers.
And so, would you mind taking us on a tour of the rest of the cemetery and telling us some of the history and who all is buried here?
Right, we'll do that. And one of the things I want to point out while we're standing here, directly behind this monument is John Chairs and his family back there. And Mrs. John Chairs was one of the ladies that helped maintain the cemetery as long as she lived. And she's buried back there. John was a nephew of Martin, and he inherited some land from Martin Chairs, and he also gave some property for the cemetery.
And so, Bill, we're now at the gravestone marker that you were referring to, which is John Chairs, the nephew of Martin Chairs, correct?
That is correct.
And you were going to tell us about the group of people that take care of the cemetery, right?
Well, initially it was some of the prominent ladies in Spring Hill, including Mrs. John Chairs. Her grave is back over here, and the other ladies were included Mrs. Rush O'Deal and Miss Ellen White. We'll stop by her gravesite over there in just a moment, and Mrs. John Wade we mentioned, and Mrs. John Chairs.
And those were the original people that took care of the cemetery.
Took care of the cemetery in the late 1800s. Now,
we still have a group like that now, correct?
Well, there is the Cemetery Association of Spring Hill, and I'll go over the names of those folks in a little bit so that we can give them recognition, because they helped me in the research of this project, and the maintenance itself is taken care of by Public Works of Spring Hill.
Okay.
They come in with their mowers and they do the mowing, and so the group that the association that's left they basically just know, they know where all the graves are. They know where there's space available should anyone desire to be buried here.
Well, and that's great that we still have a group of people that care that much about the history and care that much about taking care of the cemetery.
Exactly.
So why don't we head over to where Mrs. White?
Yes.
Okay.
Good. Ricky, you had mentioned a bit ago about the Cemetery Association. Let me mention the names of those that are still living today who are actively involved in helping us with the research that we've done on the cemetery.
That'd be great.
Mr. Harold Parks lives out Kedron Road. Jesse Harrell, Harry Lunn, and Ronnie Dark, and all of those folks have been very helpful in identifying where graves are and where there might be empty spaces, and they still have that. As I mentioned earlier, the mowing and other projects are the Spring Hill Public Works.
And those have all been longtime citizens here of Spring Hill, correct?
Exactly. And been, at one time, they were very active in the maintenance of the cemetery, but as they've aged, that has been passed on to the city. So that's what we're doing that. And here we are at Aaron White's.
Which is this main?
That's this marker here. And his
Okay.
wife Margaret is right behind you here. Dr. White and his wife housed General Earl Van Dorn first when he came to Spring Hill, and it was Mrs. White that said, "Get him out of here." And so Dr. Aaron came down to Martin Chairs, and that, as they say, the rest is history.
Right, the story that perhaps a lot of us are familiar with,
Right.
as
Yes,
far
that's
as during the Civil War and over at Ferguson Hall.
That is correct. And then we have Ellen White down here. Her marker is right over here, and she was one of the ones that was active, involved in the early preservation of the cemetery, and with the loving care of living relatives, she and the other ladies maintained the cemetery and kept it clean and neat.
So Bill, we're now in a section that obviously doesn't have, or maybe I shouldn't say obviously, it doesn't appear to have as many grave markers, but actually it's highly probable that there are more people buried here than even what we see on the markers. Is that correct?
That is correct, and it's uncertain as to whether or not these were black, maybe slaves that were buried in this area of the cemetery. Not good records were kept of those that passed that were in servitude to the community, and so we may or may not have people in this area that where their graves are unmarked. I mean, it's a good possibility that they are not marked, and we know that some of the other cemeteries, they might have been moved over with the family cemeteries like the Peters and the McKissicks, but it's just all a part of old cemeteries.
Right.
And in some places they've been able to identify them more clearly and say, you know, these are colored, or however they would have identified those individuals that were buried there.
So Bill, you were saying that there actually might be a possibility of some other gravestones that were not marked in the cemetery. Is that correct?
That is correct. In fact, this area that we're standing in right now, since 1864, there were Confederate soldiers that were buried here in unmarked graves. In fact, it wasn't until just about 3 or 4 years ago that these markers were being placed here by the Nathaniel Chairs camp of the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, and they started this project. They put the marker in here for Captain Freeman, and then they put in all the other markers. There were at least 39 that we know of that were unmarked. There were a group of ladies after the war of about 1874 or so that began to realize that there were soldiers that had been buried just all over the county and in Williamson County and here, and they began to bring them back to Spring Hill, but they did not have the funds to put markers. And so they were buried here in this area right behind us, and then, as I said, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans have made an effort to get all the graves, or at least a marker in memory of those soldiers that died. So this whole area here was unmarked until just within the last 4 or 5 years.
Wow. So you said just recently
That's
that
right,
they've been
yeah.
able to.
And see, that would have been more than 100 years ago that the soldiers' bodies were actually interred here, but they just never had markers on them. And we do have a list. The list was published of the ladies that gathered all these bodies up from around the area and brought them to Spring Hill. That list was published in the papers in the late 1800s. And from that, then these fellows have been able to work on getting the monuments.
Wow.
And it was dedicated in 2014.
Oh, okay, 2014.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah.
So obviously this is somewhat of a prominent monument here.
Right.
And can you tell us about this?
Well, Captain Freeman was the artillery commander for Nathan Bedford Forest, and when he had his artillery in place, they were overrun by the Union Army, and he, in fact, along with some others, were told to run. He had injured his leg and was unable to run, and the Union executed him. And so he was brought back here the day after he was shot, and he was buried here. And the interesting thing, Freeman's battery has continued the war as Freeman's battery, even though he was no longer living. And I thought that was a very interesting piece of history. But the Sons of the Confederate Veterans have done a marvelous job of memorializing him and dedicating this area as a sacred area for that Civil War battle.
Yes. Well, let's go around towards the front so we can take a look at some of these other markers.
Great. Let's do that.
So, Bill, as our camera guys are getting a shot of this area, the cemetery, one thing I noticed right off the bat is the marker there that says "In memory of unknown Confederate soldiers." Is that the marker that you were referring to that was erected in 1971?
That is correct. It was the Speakman chapter of the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, and they put that up because they had just learned of the location of the unknown that were buried here, and then later they got the list of names, and you'll see those all the way across the area here. And I believe there are about 5 or 6 more markers to be put in, and these were all done by the Nathaniel Chairs camp of the Sons of Confederate Veterans.
Now, what can you tell us what the reference is with the black cross marker?
That's just an insignia of the Confederate Army. You'll notice it has Sons of Confederate States of America. You can see the stars and bars in the center, then a C, S at the top, and A over here, Confederate States of America. And those were the original markers that were put out when people were known. You'll see around the cemetery there are probably a dozen or so of those markers with the black cross behind them. And then of course the markers that have the white ones that we see here, they have the company that the person fought with. Some of them there's the Arkansas Cavalry right in front of us, 3rd Arkansas Cavalry. He died in March the 5th of 1863, and then across the way you'll see some others that died at the November 29th and 30th Battle of Spring Hill and Franklin. So those are all marks there.
So we have just a couple more spots that we want to include on our tour, but one thing that we wanted to talk about is I noticed as we were going around that there were some coins on some of the gravestones.
Right. It's somewhat of a tradition that when, particularly in military cemeteries, but other cemeteries have picked this up, a penny just put on the stone or marker just indicates that the grave was visited. And you know, that's just to leave a message to the family. If they come by, they might see 15 or 20 pennies there, just indicates that somebody had stopped there. A higher valued coin would indicate, number one, that they knew the person, number two, that they may have served with that person, and they were very good friends. And so you go to some cemeteries and they will have those coins, and they just usually stay there. And whether or not they get picked up by the Cemetery Association or anybody, I don't know, but that's the tradition of coins being left on cemetery markers.
Yeah, I would imagine that there's a few people that Didn't know all that,
Yeah.
so that's interesting
And
piece
as you
of information.
pointed out, we have seen some here in the cemetery.
Right.
Like that.
And so now we're at another prominent person here in
Right.
Spring Hill, right?
This whole row of markers here are the McKissicks. Of course, they were the ones that did a lot of the construction work here in Spring Hill and of the antebellum homes. And they had a personal or family cemetery located over here behind Dr. Hardin's house. But later it was moved over here. And so all of these markers identify those people. And several of these along here are people that were actually born in the 1790s. 1790. Wow. And then they moved to Spring Hill and then passed and then were buried here in, say, 1840. So it's all very interesting as how this is a history book kind of unfolding in front of us.
Right, exactly.
It tells you where, some of them even go so far as to identify actually how old they were when they died. So many years, so many months, so many days. And I think that's quite interesting as well. Ricky, I just wanted to share with everyone that the Cemetery Association was reorganized in September of 1922. And on that occasion, Mrs. Irene Chairs, Mr. Ayers, and James O'Deal, and there was a Mrs. Rush, and Ellen White was still living at that time and involved. And then again, there were other officers appointed in 1953, and in 55, another group of officers, some of the same people over and over. And then finally, in May of 2008, and so most of these folks are still living, Jesse Harrell became the president, Donna Murphy became the vice president, Helen Dark is the treasurer, Alice Pierce, secretary and assistant treasurer. So some of those people are still living with us today and are still having an active role in the Cemetery Association.
So thank you so much for joining us here today with Soul Searchers of Spring Hill. We've got our camera guy over here, Andy, also our editor, and Josh, who you usually see with the Soul Searchers group. And be sure to join us again as we bring you more history that we can find in the regional and Williamson County area.